Welcome and thank you everyone for coming today at this event at Stanford University. My name is Evan Epstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, which is a joint initiative between Stanford Law School and the Graduate School of Business here at Stanford. So our focus is really about corporate governance in publicly traded companies and business organizations in general. So as you can imagine, we traditionally host many programs for board members, for shareholder rights, executive compensation, strategy, risk management, and so forth. So today is a special day for us because we are focusing on immigration issues in the corporate context, and this is a very niche but very relevant issue, so we're happy to have this here today. Especially now that immigration is in such sweeping and relevant changes, and this is something very important today. So it is part of our mission to actually look into the different issues involving governance, and so for us, this is a very relevant discussion. And I'm also here, well, I guess I have a keen interest in immigration because I am an immigrant myself, as I suppose many of you are. I arrived here on August 8th, 2004, so I've gone through many visas. I've gone through student visas. I've gone through OPTs. I've gone through 2 periods of H-1B. I'm transitioning to EAD card with an advanced parole travel document, and I'm finally getting hopefully my green card. So I know all the pain about this process and sometimes very stressful process. But more to the point, we're all aware that immigration is a massive issue and it's a key element in our economy. We are a country of immigrants after all, and most of us have arrived here with our own dreams, hard work and dedication. And despite the hardship, you have to love this country because of this common thread and fight in all of us in this area. A speaker quoted yesterday, there was a great event here at the law school on immigration as well. And he quoted a movie line where the president, played by Michael Douglas, said that America isn't easy. And I couldn't agree more. I think that its immigration policies are certainly not easy. So I hope that today we can do some progress with this conference in helping at least clarifying some of the issues of immigration in the corporate side. And on behalf of the Rock Center, of Stanford Law School, of Stanford University, I welcome all of you, and we look forward to this 3rd annual Worksite Immigration Compliance Symposium. So thank you, and we'll get it started.
Thank you, Evan. I figured it was only appropriate to have us kick off with the guy with the South African accent that always makes you sound so smart, and kind of nimble and clever. All the hard work at the Rock Center is done by Evan Epstein. He's the executive director. The rest of us faculty, we just kind of hang around and show up when he says we're ready to go. So that's what I'm doing now. He says we're ready to go. It's my pleasure to introduce Representative Zoe Lofgren. I don't think there is any congressperson who is more a fundamental product and a perfect representation of her district. She is a Silicon Valley native and is the Democratic member of the United States House of Representatives for District 19. She has been so since 1995. She is from San Jose, from this area. I'm glad to say she earned her BA at Stanford University and earned her law degree at another university we consider friendly, Santa Clara, and in fact was a practicing and then teaching, immigration lawyer and taught immigration law. But more importantly, I want to mention a couple things that don't show up in her bio, and then I'll give you a couple other tidbits and then ask her to come up and speak with us. She is one of the few members of Congress who I've interacted with who every time you talk to them about immigration, whether it be at a hearing or before or after, and I know she sees hundreds of people, so she won't remember these interactions with me, but in the last round, when you would talk to certain members of the House and certain members of the Senate, they would ask you questions that clearly their staffers had handed them, and they would listen to you and they would nod, and maybe they wouldn't even look at you. They might be writing notes, I think something unrelated to what you were talking about, and then they would kind of look up and nod, and they'd say, "Thank you very much, Professor Siciliano." Thank you, right? It was a completely different experience with Representative Lofgren. So first of all, I could tell that her questions were her own. They were informed. She actually listened very carefully. Her earnestness and her interest was genuine, and then the questions she asked as follow-up were helpful. And I can't say this about most of the hearings I participated on the Hill, but the ones that involved her were actually enjoyable, and I walked away with a sense of hope and happiness and feeling like I'm glad and proud to be someone who lives in the 19th District. So I should say that Representative Lofgren is also chair of the California Congressional Delegation. She is well known for her work outside of immigration law, including patent reform, copyright issues, digital rights, and net neutrality. Again, there's no better congressperson situated and fit for Silicon Valley. She is the highest ranking Democrat and former chair of the Subcommittee on Immigration Policy and Enforcement. And obviously is a longtime advocate of comprehensive immigration reform. She has authored and co-authored many critical pieces of legislation, not the least of which is the Immigration Driving Entrepreneurship in America Act of 2011 and the Protecting American Families and Business Act of 2011 as well. I will let her come up in just a moment, but I want to mention one other thing. We are in Silicon Valley. We are at Stanford. A lot of people don't know that on December 15th, 2011, she was declared a hero of the internet in her role in the House Judiciary Committee hearings related to the Stop Online Piracy Act, in which she defended the current state of the internet, something near and dear to all of our hearts here in Silicon Valley. So with that, I want to thank her for coming all the way out here early in the morning and introduce Representative Zoe Lofgren. Please help her feel welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. As I've been drinking coffee and visiting, it's been fun to see former witnesses from when I chaired the Immigration Subcommittee. Dan did a fabulous job a few years ago as a witness, as have numerous others here. You know, we may or may not be at a key flex point on the reform of immigration law. That remains to be seen. But I think it's worth putting a little perspective on where we've come, where we are, and how we might move forward. You know, the Congress hasn't revised the immigration law substantially very often. We all know that in 1965, we really came up with the basic framework of family business per country allocation. People are talking now, hello Doris, people are talking now in Washington about the failure of the '86 Act, the Reagan amnesty, and clearly it did allow people who are undocumented to gain their legal residence, but it did very little to prevent the accumulation of other people who were here in an undocumented status. In 1990, under the chairmanship of then Congressman Bruce Morrison, there was an effort to update the act, but honestly, although it was a good faith effort, it's difficult to make substantial changes, and the forces that moved the people into the U.S. in a non-documented status were really not adequately addressed in that bill. And of course, I was elected in 1994. I was the freshman Democratic class west of the Rockies that year. And in '96, with the new Republican majority, we actually took the country in the other direction and made it much more difficult for people to comply with the immigration laws. One of the things that I want to give thanks to the Migration Policy Institute and Doris for the research that they do, but the estimate that the inclusion of a provision of law called the 3- and 10-year bar, where if you were otherwise eligible for a visa, but you had been in an undocumented status for more than a year, you had to leave the country for 10 years. Well, as I said in 1996, this is just going to make things worse. How unsatisfactory are the words, "I told you so"? The estimate is now that somewhere around a third of the people who are here in an undocumented status would have had the capacity to comply with the law, except for that unreasonable provision. So here we are, it's 2013, and we have a system that is basically dysfunctional. And it's dysfunctional no matter where you look. People say, well, people should come here, but they should have gone through the system and gotten in line. And I think many of the people who say that believe it, and they're good Americans and are trying to be reasonable. They just don't know there is no line. When I chaired the immigration subcommittee for 4 years, my goal was to how do you put together a comprehensive coalition to try and reform the law? And you know, years ago when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, Professor Ray Wolfinger told me that the art of lobbying is how do I help you help me? And so we put together an effort to try and have a broad coalition. I'll never forget the meeting that we had in then Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office. And it was, you know, there's a broad swath of the religious community. And among evangelicals, there's everything from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. And we had the conservative wing of the evangelicals there. And I looked around this room, about 40 pastors, and I thought, these people probably think I'm the devil, except for this issue where we're going to work together on. We worked with the business community, worked with agriculture, with evangelicals, and like to try and put together a comprehensive support system for immigration reform. Well, that didn't work. In 2006 and 2007, as we know, efforts that began in the Senate basically crashed and burned. And why did that happen? Most Americans, if you look at the polling, most Americans, if asked this question, what's the best way to do it? Round up 11 million people and deport them, or make them step forward, identify themselves, get right with the law, and move forward? Like 70% will choose the latter approach. But for the 30 or 25 or 30% who don't agree, there was fierce opposition to that proposition. And what we saw, organized by Numbers USA, the Federation for American Immigration Reform and certain other groups, was a massive telephone campaign to basically sink the reform effort in 2007. There were so many calls into the Senate that the phone system broke down and no one could get a call in. And I think that played a role in scaring the Senate off from the reform effort. Now, what's happened since then? We have a system, we had an analysis done recently that if you are applying for, and you have a labor certification which proves that there's no American available to do the job that you are offered, and you have a bachelor's of science degree, and you were born in India, you have a 70-year wait for your priority date to come up, 7-0. If you file a petition for your sister who was born in Mexico, you're an American citizen, to come to the United States, the most recent estimate is it will be 163 years until the number comes up for your sister. So obviously, this is completely a dysfunctional system. We have a situation where husbands and wives who are legally immigrating to the United States can be separated for as much as half a decade. We have, whether it's business, family, a dysfunctional system. We have this other phenomena that occurred that I think has given a little bit of steam to the reform effort, and that is the election of last year. Now, I think the Republicans in the United States are well aware that Governor Romney got less than 30% of the vote among Asian American voters. He got less than 30% of the vote among Latino voters, and these two demographic groups are the fastest growing demographic groups in the United States. I think there's a very clear-eyed analysis that if the Republicans can't get right with these two demographic groups, they're never going to have a Republican president again. So doing immigration reform won't necessarily get them votes in these two demographic groups, but unless they can get right with this group, they can't even be heard. Some of the polling data and the focus groups I've seen is that if you can't get right on this issue, you can't even talk about another issue. And it's not because everybody who's Latino or Asian in America is an immigrant or has an immigrant family, but it's the rhetoric has been so insulting and so demeaning. People take it very personally. And so we've got to get past that. And we're, on the Democratic side, quite happy to compete on other issues. We want to get a reform effort done. Now, one of the things I've pledged not to do is to discuss what is actually happening in the formally secret group that's been meeting in the House. But I will say, because this has been reported in the paper, that we, a group of us, started meeting 4.5 years ago to see could we reach a bipartisan consensus to reform the immigration laws. And it's really a remarkable phenomena because there were several years ago where we'd meet 2 and 3 times a week with a group as big as 25 people, and the press never found out. No one ever said anything. It was a completely confidential process. And why was that important? I mean, on the Democratic side, you know, there are some Democrats who are not pro-immigration reform, but it's an easier lift for us. For many Republicans, this was not an easy thing for them to do, and we needed a confidential space where people could try out ideas, sort through, you know, the pros and cons, come to a common understanding of the facts, and it was a very healthy process. About a few months ago, the existence of this group was intentionally revealed, but I will say, you know, if we had a bill drafted, it would be released. So, I mean, when we are in session, we meet every day for hours. That's all I do, immigration all day, every day, trying to reach conclusions on contentious issues. And what are the various elements? I'm not going to talk about the House bill, but in the Senate bill, there's certainly, you can see what the hot button issues are that need to be addressed. First, the American people want assurances about security. And I believe, given what's gone on in Boston and the fact that the 2 alleged bombers were immigrants, but they came as children, I guess, as refugees. It's probably homegrown terrorism. They were raised in the United States. But anything that relates to, you know, horrible stuff done by someone not born here elevates the anxiety level, not irrationally. We need to make sure that we can give assurances to the American people that we're in control of this situation, that people aren't just wandering willy-nilly across the border without inspection, that, you know, it's been an interesting matter for Republicans to learn that 40% of the undocumented people in the United States came legally and overstayed their visa. So it's not just an issue about border. It's about making sure that people who come on a temporary status actually leave, and that we know where they are. The sense in 1986 that, you know, how you see the world oftentimes depends on where you sit. Republicans will say the 86 Act didn't work because there was no workplace enforcement, which was pretty much true. Democrats will say the 86 Act didn't work because there was no way for people to legally get in, which was also true. So we need to make sure, I think, you know, I have fought against the E-Verify program. I had a number of issues, and we can get into why that was a problem. But I've come to the conclusion, personally, that if we have a workable system, you have to be willing to enforce that system. And probably that will include some kind of a bumped-up verification system for people working in the country. We also need to make sure that we have an adequate opportunity, legal opportunity, for people who are needed in our economy to come here. You know, when I was the chairwoman, in part of our effort to reach bipartisan support groups, I knew Dr. Richard Land. When I called him, the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, he came over to my office. We spent about 3 hours, and he said it was the first time really he'd had an opportunity to spend that amount of time with a Democrat. And the Southern Baptists have come out full bore for comprehensive immigration reform. I invited Dr. Land to be a witness in the subcommittee, and I always mention this because I don't want to steal his great line. He said, for years we've had 2 signs at the southern border. One said help wanted, and the other said no trespassing. So, we sort of created the situation of the 11 million people who are currently here in an undocumented status. We need to find a way for those people to step forward and get right with the law, move on with their lives. And it's clear that we should not permit 11 million people to stay in some permanent underclass status. I mean, there has to be, people are complaining that the Senate bill takes too long. It may be a burdensome process, but people have to have the capacity to become Americans, and that is a bottom line issue. And we need to have both I think on a permanent basis and on a temporary basis, the ability for people to come into the United States legally. And that's everything from the 2 million estimated migrant farm workers who are here without their documents to, I mean, we've got, people walking across the stage getting their PhDs in computer science at Stanford that we're going to make leave and go home instead of starting a company here, and in between. We need to make sure that we have the capacity to enrich our economy through the talent of immigrants. And finally, we need to do the right thing about families. There's no reason, in my mind, why husbands and wives, little children and parents should be separated for a half a decade in the legal immigration system. Whose interest does that serve? And so I think there is a growing sense, and you see it in the Senate bill, to take steps to prevent that separation from occurring. Now, what else in the Senate bill is going to be controversial? And I'll stop with this in case there's a question or two that I can answer. The elimination of the sibling category has caused consternation in some circles. I would note, however, that there's another side to this issue. First, as I mentioned, the sibling category is essentially a fraud at this point. If you are from Mexico, to say that your sibling will get a visa in 163 years, I mean, that's not even a program. That's stupid. Similar backlogs are people from the Philippines, from certain Asian countries, and this has always been perceived as an Asian American issue, although in fact it is primarily a Mexican issue. Most of the pending applications are siblings from Mexico. 60 years, 90 years, this is not a real program. And so I think as people become disappointed about the elimination of the sibling category, there needs to be a realistic assessment of whether anything is actually being lost, given the backlogs. The other thing, though, that the Senate did, and we'll see whether this makes it to the finish line, is because they wanted all undocumented workers to follow behind everybody waiting in line, they did 2 things. One, allowed 18 months for new sibling petitions to be filed, which right now there's 2.5 million people in the sibling line, roughly 2.5 million people. That, who knows, how will that double? We don't know if there's an 18-month period for people to file. But the concept is that everybody in that line will automatically get a legal permanent residence visa in 10 years. That's a lot of immigration. And I don't know when the Numbers USA people dissect this bill whether that's going to be embraced or not. Another controversial issue, and it may surprise you, is the elimination of the diversity visa in the Senate bill. The diversity visa is actually, in a way, it's a misnomer. I mean, people assume because of the name, that it has to do with, making sure we have the rich diversity in our country. Not so. It's any country that hasn't sent 50,000 visas in the last 3 years has the ability for their citizens to apply to a lottery. It's a minimum high school diploma. I think last year we had 1.5 million people apply. There's 50,000 visas, and it's done on a random basis. So the question is, there's some issue because about 40% of those visas were allocated to the continent of Africa. However, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 18,000 visas. And the question is, can we make sure that we are not excluding immigration from Africa prospectively? Because I think that is important. I think that there are ways to achieve diversity without a lottery. And that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. How do we make sure that that the richness that we get from immigration from throughout the world is maintained because it benefits our country. And so, there'll be a lot of discussion about that issue in Washington. And one of the things I note is that we actually have more people from sub-Saharan Africa coming in the refugee program than we do on the lottery program. So we're going to be paying some attention to making sure that our country is not crippled by turning away from the diversity that has come into the country. With that, just a word on our group. When I read the Senate bill, it looked to me that it was the product of hurry, honestly. It took me 12 hours to get from Washington to my house yesterday because of weather. Sat on the plane for 4 hours before we took off and the like. So it gave me plenty of time to read an 800-page bill. I think that there are some drafting errors and some things that will definitely need cleanup. On the House side, I'll just say we have been incredibly careful trying to make sure, without going into what we're doing, that it's carefully crafted and tight legally. I do think that as legislators, we owe that to the public and to the country. Whether we'll actually get to the end of our process, there's no telling. There's no telling because it hasn't occurred yet. But I will say that in the end, this is going to be a decision made by the Republicans. We've shown tremendous flexibility. We want to get a deal. But if we start to see drifting away from core elements, for example, as you may have noted, the 70 growers associations and the United Farm Workers reached an agreement. The Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO reached an agreement. Who could imagine? If there is big departures from agreements, it may be an indication that people don't actually want a bill. So we've got some shoals ahead of us. All I can say is that I've worked now for 19 years to get reform of the immigration laws. I think we have potentially our best opportunity, but there is a lot of road to travel before we get to the end, and I've just pledged to you I'm going to do my very best to make sure that we get there. With that, thanks so much. I look forward to serving on the panel. Should we take 2 questions?
Yes, if you could, if you're willing to take a couple of questions. Anyone who wants to ask a question, if we could ask you to stand at a microphone, we'll do that for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And while we're doing that, why don't we have the panel go ahead and start to get seated if Representative Lofgren is willing to answer some questions in the meantime.
We disagreed during the STEM jobs.
Vivek, could you stand at a microphone? Only because that way it'll get caught on tape, if you don't mind. Thanks.
If you recall, we disagreed about the STEM Jobs Act, and I was very critical of the fact that the Democrats had torpedoed legislation which otherwise was very decent, and the issue was diversity visa. That's being sacrificed right now in the Senate. So my question to you is, do you regret not having voted for that?
Absolutely not. Lamar Smith never had an intention to get that bill through, or else he would have not targeted the diversity visa to go to the tech side. I made multiple efforts to talk to him about reaching a conclusion, which he refused to do. And it was really, and we're paying the price for that right now, because in highlighting the elimination of the diversity visa for the tech sector, he highlighted the distribution, and especially to Africa, and has created a tremendous political barrier to the elimination of the diversity visa. I've known Lamar for 19 years. I don't think that was unintended. I like Lamar fine, and we work together on some things. He is not a supporter of immigration reform. And so I think that effort was really precedent to causing problems for this reform effort. In the Senate bill, and I won't go into the House side, there is a dramatic expansion of permanent residence visas for the tech sector. The startup provision, I think, is poorly crafted, but can be crafted better. There's an expansion of H-1Bs that I think also could be better drafted. But there's, I mean, a massive expansion of visas in the tech sector. I think that we need to make sure that the system is not abused, which there has been abuse in some cases, but certainly I know that half the startups in Silicon Valley were started by people who were born in another country. So it's absolutely in America's interest that those individuals have a chance to stay and be Americans. I just regret that Lamar did what he did and made our current effort more complicated.
He outmaneuvered you in that one. I hope that you'll fight for us on this one and outsmart those people this time.
Hi. I know you can't talk about what the House bill is going to look like, but I was wondering if you could talk about the provisions in the Senate bill that the Republicans in the House, or just the Republicans, might have the most issues with, that are going to be the most contentious.
Well, I can't talk about what the Republicans are thinking because, number one, I don't want to speak for them, and number two, we promise not to go through our confidential deliberations. But I'll just say, if you take a look at the polling data, Republican voters want some assurances that serious steps are going to be taken on security. And I think that's not unreasonable. I think we can only do something that's achievable, but it's not unfair to say that we should actually take this seriously. So that's, I think, one issue if you take a look at where the Republican public is. I do think that in terms of the future flow visa situation, that the Farm Bureau and the UFW, that the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce could come to an agreement is stunning. Nevertheless, it's been reported in the paper that there's certain businesses are now coming over trying to, change the deal they made. I don't think they realize how risky that is. Because the entire thing could go off the rails. If you make a deal, you ought to stick with your deal, and you ought to sell your deal. And I think, this is, as you get closer, it's like Zeno's paradox. Are you ever going to get to the end? And as people see that something is viable, the element of greed comes in, and people want more, and at some point, they can end up doing damage to the process itself. With that, thank you very much.